Hi everybody. Today I'm going to be reading The Memory Coat, and it's by Elvira Woodruff. You're going to need to know that for your notes. You'll be taking notes today to write a summary. You've got information in Google Classroom about all of the different details that you need to pay attention to in order to write a good story summary. So let's begin. Long ago, a young girl named Rachel and her cousin Grisha lived with their family in a small town far away in Russia. Such a town was called Ashidal. It was here where many of the Jewish people lived. There they worked as cobblers, blacksmiths, tailors, and shopkeepers. The little wooden houses and shops ran all along the cobblestone streets. And there's a really good picture. In class, we talked about what a cobbler was. Not many people knew what a cobbler was. A cobbler is a shoemaker. And then a tailor is somebody who makes clothing. These houses were often filled with large and lively families. Rachel and Grisha had such a family, and oh, what a commotion they made. There always seemed to be a baby crying in the cradle, a cousin tapping at the door, an older sister humming at the stove, a younger sister pleading for something to eat, and always there was Rachel chattering away. And in the midst of all this and that, there was their grandmother, Baba, who was covering her ears and shushing them. Shh, kabud avyem, she would say. Now that's in Yiddish, and I don't know what that means in Yiddish, but I guess we know what she's trying to tell everybody. Be quiet. But quiet is something that Rachel could never be, for she loved to tell stories, and her cousin Grisha loved to draw pictures to go along with them. From the first morning light to the setting of the sun, Rachel and Grisha's stories continued. They were the best of friends, and they shared all their deepest secrets. But it had barely been a year ago that Grisha had come to live with Rachel's family. He had been orphaned when he lost his parents in an epidemic, and there were still times when he would run to the alley behind the synagogue where he could be alone to grieve. At these times, Rachel's mother and grandmother worried about Grisha being outdoors in the cold, with only his threadbare coat to keep him warm. And we talked about what threadbare meant. It means like his coat is very, very thin, and the threads are just kind of very, very thin, not keeping him very warm. But whenever they offered to make him a new one, Grisha always refused. I like my coat the way it is, he would tell them sharply, and he'd race out into the icy wind. Then Rachel would throw on her own warm woolen coat and fly out the door to comfort him. Grisha always found great comfort in their storytelling game. And once they began, the game could last for hours. One day, Rachel pointed out a mouse that had run under a wagon. Such a long tail, Grisha sighed. Yes, he's very fine, Rachel agreed. And look, he's come from the Tsar's palace with a message. Rachel's voice grew low and shivery with excitement as she went on to tell the story of this enchanted mouse. Go ahead, Grisha, draw it just as I say. With his mittened fingers curled around a frosted twig, Grisha scratched a dazzling castle in the snow. In its turret he drew a mouse with a miniature sword in his paw and a tiny smile on his whiskered face. And so the two spent many a frosty afternoon in the alley behind the synagogue, with Rachel weaving her words for Grisha's swirling figures in the snow. Meanwhile, from the temple, their grandfather's chanted prayers were as comforting as a lullaby. Oh, what figurative language is that? His prayers were as comforting as a lullaby. I bet that's a simile because it's comparing two things using like or as. Life was simple and bittersweet, and it seemed that these times would never end. Now, we just talked about connectives and how writers use different things to connect different parts of their story. And because the writer here uses the word seemed, it kind of gives us the impression that these good times are not going to last forever. Then one day, news spread through the marketplace that the Cossacks were coming on powerful horses and waving sharp swords. They were looking to kill anyone who was Jewish. There was great chaos as babies cried, dogs barked, and wagons clattered over cobblestones. People screamed and shouted and ran to hide in their cellars and attics and barns. From the attic window, Rachel and Grisha trembled as the Cossacks swept through their town. "Russia is no longer a safe place for us to live," their grandfather whispered late that night, as the frightened family gathered together. We must not wait for our children's blood to color the snow," Rachel's father added. "We must go to America. In America, they will be safe." So the family set out making plans to leave. They sold most of what they owned to buy their tickets and say goodbye as, one by one, friends and neighbors packed and left. In the days that followed, Rachel's family wondered and worried about the journey they were about to make. They had heard stories about the long, hard ocean voyage and of the dangers along the way. But the tales that frightened them the most were those of immigrants who had given up so much and traveled so far only to be turned away at a place called Ellis Island, an inspection station in New York's harbor. These immigrants were inspected to be sure that they were healthy and had enough money to take care of themselves. And here's a really nice illustration of everybody packing up and getting ready to make this long voyage. "We must make a good impression so that we'll be allowed to stay in America," their grandfather told them, as the family gathered around the table for the last time. "If we make one mistake, we could be separated forever." Everyone shuddered at the thought. "There will be no mistakes," Rachel's father said. Then we'll have to do something about Grisha's coat," Bubba added. "Look how torn and tattered it's become. If we're to make a good impression, he will have to have a new one. Come, Grisha, let me measure your arms." "No!" Grisha cried. He grabbed the coat and ran to the attic to hide. His aunts and uncles clucked and shook their heads. "What can he see in such an old coat?" "He sees the inside," Rachel whispered. "It's lined with the beautiful wool of his own mother's coat. Inside, he can still feel his mama's touch." Ah, his grandfather's sad sigh filled the room as a fierce wind whistled around the windows. Everyone lowered their eyes, ashamed at having forgotten how Grisha's dear mother had struggled to make him this little coat in the last winter of her life. Not another word was spoken about it, and Bubba took out her basket to mend the coat once more. Early the next morning, the family packed their few belongings and said goodbye to the only place they'd ever called home. Together, they made the difficult journey, first by wagon, then by train, and finally by the big ship that crossed the ocean to America. The rough ocean voyage took 14 days. To comfort themselves, Rachel and Grisha played their story game. By the time they reached New York's harbor, they had left a trail of their stories and drawings sketching all the way back to Russia. And so it was that this family made its way to a long line of people to this place called Ellis Island, and so it was that Grisha's tattered coat made its way along with them. Grisha and Rachel held tight to their grandmother's skirts, and they were swept along in the crowd. As the din of thousands of strange voices echoed through the large hall, they couldn't help wondering and worrying about the inspectors who watched them. Would they pass inspections? Would they be sent back to Russia? Would the family be separated forever? What do you think? They waited in one line, then another, and then another. To still their fears, Rachel and Grisha continued their game. "Once there lived a magical bird with golden feathers," Rachel began. Grisha took out a pencil and a piece of paper he'd found and leaned against a plaster pillar as he drew. As she told her story, Rachel spread her arms out and pretended to fly. but she suddenly lost her balance and fell against Grisha. The two tumbled down and knocked over Bubba's basket beside them. Rachel was unhurt, but Grisha scratched his eye on the basket's lid. So here's the picture of that event. So now that Grisha has scratched his eye, is he going to pass inspection? By the time his turn came to be examined, Grisha's injured eye looked quite red and irritated. When the doctor lifted Grisha's eyelid, Grisha cried out with pain. Taking a quick look, the doctor marked a large letter E in chalk on the back of Grisha's coat. Rachel felt her Bubba's hand tightening around her own as everyone began to talk at once. Something was wrong. Something was happening to Grisha. He hadn't passed the inspection. He was going to be sent back to Russia. His eye is healthy. It is just scratched, Rachel's father pleaded to the inspector. But the interpreter had stepped away. The doctor could not understand Russian or Yiddish, and Rachel's father could not speak a word of English. So the doctor just shook his head, and the chalk E remained. What do you think the chalk E stands for? We had a hard time figuring it out. I actually had to read the author's notes to figure it out. The reason they wrote a letter E on the back of his coat is because he had an eye injury. And that let all the other inspectors know that he was not going to be allowed into America. The children were sent to sit on a bench and wait. Why won't they let Grisha stay? Rachel's younger sister asked. Maybe it's his raggedy old coat, said the other sister. You should have listened to Bubba and let them make you a new one. I won't let them take you, Rachel whispered to Grisha. Now, since Rachel said that to Grisha, that leads us to believe that maybe she has a plan. So what do you think she's going to do in order for Grisha to be able to stay in the United States? Here's her plan. Suddenly, Rachel had an idea. Quickly, she pulled off Grisha's coat and turned it inside out, exposing the beautiful wool from his mother's coat. Now, the dreaded chalk mark was hidden from view, and Rachel's father was able to walk Grisha over to another line where he was examined once more. The doctor was kinder and more patient, and he understood Yiddish. He took a closer look at Grisha's eye and saw that it was only a scratch. So he kept his chalk in his pocket, and Grisha passed through with the rest of the family. Such a one, Rachel's father cried as he lifted Rachel and kissed her on her cheeks. Everyone was laughing and crying at once. Bubba hugged Rachel and Grisha tight. You were right, Grisha, Bubba said. This coat of yours is very special. Your mama's touch will be with you for a very long time. Not only on the outside, but here, she said, tapping Grisha's chest, on the inside, the most important place of all. And here's Grisha hugging them, or Bubba hugging Grisha and Rachel. Now, so many winters later, the cousins' whispered stories can be heard no more. But in a land far from the icy Russian winds, Grisha's tattered coat has been passed down to his children and to his grandchildren, and it remains to tell a bigger story. For in that worn bit of wool held together by caring stitches are the memories of a mother's love and of a family's journey made so long ago. The end.